Mr. President, thanks very much for being with us. You call your book Victories, Defeat, and Renewal. Now, is there a renewal of Richard Nixon underway with the Bush administration? Are you consulted? Do you occupy the position in American life that you'd like to occupy?
Well, the position I occupy is one of saying what I believe, as I do in this program, and from time to time passing on my views to the administration when I think it might be of use to them. As far as being the power behind the throne, the major advisor, that's all nonsense. I am not, and nobody else is, and George Bush wouldn't like it, and he shouldn't like it.
How much do you get consulted by the President?
He is very receptive to my views when I pass them on. But let me say, I don't do it very often. It's only when I think I have experience in an area that some of his advisors may not be up to speed on that I pass something on. But I, having been president, I know that there's nothing that you appreciate less than to have well-intentioned, even former presidents, calling and say, why don't you do this, why don't you do that, and so forth and so on. The president's problems basically are not primarily with his enemies, they're with his friends who think they know how to run the thing better than he does. And I never want to be in that position with George Bush.
How do you feel toward him? Do you feel toward him as though he's your kid brother, in view of the fact that you appointed him to many of his positions, Republican National Chairman, UN Ambassador, and so on? Do you have that kind of relationship with him?
No, I'm a bit more formal than that. I never forget the last time I saw Eisenhower. He knew that it was near the end. And before I left the room, I said, you know, Mr. President, before I go back to the Capitol or to the White House, I just want to say that the country will always be in your debt for what you have done in war and in peace. And he said, you are very generous to say that. And he said, I have only one regret at this time. He said, after you are inaugurated, I can no longer call you Dick. Now, in fact, George Bush insists that I call him George. Ronald Reagan insists that I call him Ron. But on the other hand, I think of George Bush not as a younger brother and not as a protege, but he's president. That's the way I feel about it. And I think he appreciates that.
In terms of ideology and even policy, can't it be said that the Bush administration is a kind of a continuation or an extension of the Nixon administration? After all, Brent Scowcroft, who was a protege of Henry Kissinger, and Lawrence Eagleburger, another protege, are both in there in high-ranking positions. The president was an official under you, and many other people in the White House staff, for example, were officials of the Nixon administration. Are there differences in tone, or is it a continuation?
Well, answering that question, I recall very well when I was a member of Congress, a very conservative Southern Democrat came across the aisle one day to speak to Vito Marcantonio, who was almost communist. Some people thought that he was. Marcantonio had voted for a pet project of this Southern Democrat, John Rankin. And he says, Mark, he says, thanks for that vote. He says, I'll come into your district and campaign for you or against you, whichever helped you the most. Now, let me say that with regard to George Bush, as to whether it's a continuation of the Nixon administration, if I were to suggest that it were, that would probably hurt him. So therefore, let's just say this is the Bush administration, and I'm glad that generally, I'm able to support its major foreign policy initiatives.
How does Dan Quayle stack up to your standard as a vice presidential emissary?
I think Dan Quayle has done extremely well considering what he was up against. I've often said it's very difficult to be vice president with a very popular president. I had a little of that myself, and George Bush had it with Reagan. Now Dan Quayle has it with Bush. I was talking to a friend, liberal Republican, a few days ago, and who had heard Quayle speak for the first time. And I said, what did you think of him? He said, I must say I was surprised. From what I had read in the media, I thought the guy was a moron. Well, now that, of course, helps Quayle. The expectations are so low that all he has to do is to go out and show that he's able to handle himself. I think he's handled himself very well in his foreign trips. And I think another point that Quayle deserves high marks on is his staff. He isn't afraid to have people that are as smart as he is or even smarter than he is around him. I would say, too, therefore, that as far as Quayle is concerned, you should not count him out. He has a way to go because he started from a very low level. but don't count him out.
Well, how do you think Bush will come out in the ranking of post-war presidents?
But based on his present popularity, he should rank very high. But his great challenges lie ahead. 89 was an easy year, thank heaven. 90 will be more difficult. I think he will meet that challenge, however. But George Bush is fortunate in one way. I, as you know, often quote Churchill. Churchill wrote about Lord Rosebery, a British prime minister, back in the 19th century, that he had the misfortune of being born at a time of great men and small events. George Bush does not have that misfortune. He has the good fortune to be born in a time of great events. He has the challenge of winning the Cold War. He has the challenge of developing a relationship with the Japanese in a time that's going to be very difficult. He has the challenge of dealing with problems at home, everything from the environment to education, to child care, etc. And with all of these great challenges, the great events, all George Bush has to do is to measure up to the great events. But it's far better to have that challenge than to be a great man with only small events.
When did you first meet George Bush? I met him back in 1952, I believe. It might have been before that because his father, of course, was in the Senate, and I knew him in the Senate. But in 1952, he was one of my young advance men, so to speak, when I campaigned in Texas, and he was a vigorous go-go guy.
One got the impression from the outside, and you know it's a press impression, of never actually making a difference in any of the jobs that he ever held. He performed according to the instructions that he received at the UN and the CIA and other places, but no one ever could tell that he ever really made a difference. But did he? You were his boss.
Well, I've seen a little of that speculation, but let's look at the other side of it. He never made any mistakes. I mean, I think one thing about George Bush that people overlook is that he is not mistake-prone. If he does make them, they're just fumbles which he recovers himself. But George Bush was always considered a comer. He was one of our young men coming along. And it's interesting that Eisenhower, who is a pretty good picker, at least he always considered himself to be, that he focused on Bush way back in 1967, which I don't think Bush knew at the time.
Yeah.
By now it's clear that George Bush won't suffer Lord Rosebery's fate. He is on the world stage in a time of great events. Of these, perhaps the most momentous is the collapse of communism, both as a military threat and, more importantly, as an idea. Richard Nixon came to the House of Representatives at the dawn of the Cold War, just as the Soviet Union was turning from a wartime ally to the geopolitical enemy of the United States. The 34-year-old Californian lost no time minting his anti-communist credentials. Together with a freshman Democrat from Massachusetts, Congressman Nixon supported the Greek-Turkish loan program and the Marshall Plan to reconstruct war-torn Western Europe. Throughout his career, Richard Nixon was a staunch supporter of foreign aid as a tool against communist expansion in the Third World. Before the McCarthy era polarized American politics, Nixon led the charge against Alger Hiss, a high-ranking State Department official accused of being a Soviet spy. Throughout 1948 and 49, Nixon's House Un-American Activities Committee matched wits with the aristocratic Hiss. Despite incriminating testimony by Whittaker Chambers, himself an ex-communist, Hiss professed innocence. Backing Hiss were Secretary of State Atchison and even President Truman, but to no avail. Hiss was convicted on 2 counts of perjury in 1950 and sentenced to 5 years in prison. That year, Nixon wrote, "The Hiss case proved beyond any reasonable doubt the existence of Soviet-directed communist subversion at the highest levels of American government." His triumph in the Hiss case transformed Richard Nixon into a national figure. As Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon carried on the crusade at home and on many trips abroad to outposts of the Cold War.
Vice President and Mrs. Nixon are greeted at Montevideo. Next stop, Argentina, where traffic delays him on his way to the inaugural ceremonies. Vice President Nixon receives a cordial welcome from President Syngman Rhee. as he visits Seoul on his round-the-world goodwill tour.
In Moscow, Nixon defended American capitalism in the famous kitchen debate with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in 1959.
And I can only say that if this competition, which you have just described so effectively, in which you plan to outstrip us, and particularly in the production of consumer goods, if this competition is to do the best for both of our peoples and for people everywhere, there must be a free exchange of ideas. If the present trend continues, if Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, will be the next president of the United States.
After losing his first presidential bid in 1960, Nixon berated Presidents Kennedy and Johnson for being too soft on communism. But by the time he was elected president in 1968, Nixon unveiled a new strategy. With the U.S. mired in the Vietnam War, the Soviets near equals in nuclear weapons capability, and the Chinese seeming to turn inward, Nixon launched a policy of détente, or a new accommodation with the communist world.
As great powers, we shall sometimes be competitors, but we need never be enemies. If we can find common ground to work together, the chance for world peace is immeasurably increased.
Nixon's 1972 speeches in Moscow and Beijing were the high watermark of détente. 18 years later, Richard Nixon defends his détente policy against revisionists who argue that it gave the Soviets a decade to postpone reform. Similarly, Nixon claims that the tragic events in Tiananmen Square shouldn't obscure the strategic necessity of America's opening to the world's most populous nation.
You are perhaps still a staunch anti-communist, and yet in 1968 you seemed to change. In the campaign you said that it was time no longer for confrontation, but a time for negotiation, and launched into a détente policy toward the Soviet Union. Why?
What happened after I became president was that I had to look at the world as I found it then. And I saw that with the Vietnam War going on, we had to make moves toward the Soviet Union, toward China, and others as well, in order to deal with that problem and in order to build for the future. Interestingly enough, I was criticized by some, by the far right, and praised by the far left, both for the same and the wrong reason. The far right said he went to China because that proves he's soft on communism. And the far left said, no, he went to China, and they said the old Cold Warrior has finally found that communism isn't that bad. Going to China had nothing to do with communism. It had to do with the strategic relationship between the United States and China.
Was it based on the notion, that is particularly détente with the Soviet Union and the decision to negotiate with them, on the Whittaker-Chambers view of the world? That is, that we're on the right side of history, but we're on the losing side of history. And were you trying to prevent us from losing by reaching accommodations with the Soviet Union?
Whittaker-Chambers, you point out, felt when he testified before us way back in 1948 that we were on the losing side, and that when he left the Communist Party, he felt that he was leaving the winning side. I have never felt that. I felt that the Soviet Union was formidable militarily, and in 1968, for example, and in 1969, when I started the process of détente with the Soviet Union, I thought it was important that we negotiate with them with regard to nuclear arms, where we were in a race that neither was going to win. Under the circumstances, that negotiation, I think, proved to be the right thing to do. But let me point out, that wasn't soft-headed negotiation. Every time the Soviet Union engaged in aggressive tactics, for example, when they tried to put a nuclear submarine base in the Cienfuegos, we just stopped the negotiations. When, for example, they supported India in its efforts to gobble up the rest of Pakistan in 1971, we said we're not going to come to Moscow for a summit meeting, which they wanted in 1972. And in 1973, when they tried to intervene in the Yom Kippur War, we even called an alert to keep them out. Let me say, good relations, that was a détente, whatever you call, with the Soviet Union, cannot be a one-way street. If they misbehave, you must link their behavior to other things.
Let me contrast your strategy with the Soviet Union, the détente strategy, with the strategy of Reagan. Now, it seems that what Reagan did was to stress the Soviet Union by having a big military buildup, by calling them the evil empire, and so on. And eventually, they gave. They cried uncle, and they acknowledged their internal problems, and so on and so forth. Now, wasn't that in the end a better strategy than making deals with them?
A case could be made for that, but we have to have in mind that the situation at the time that Reagan was president had changed a great deal from the time I was president. At the time I was president, we're talking now in the period from 1969 to 1974, the Soviet Union was not in, or did not perceive itself to be in, the economic doldrums. The Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower. It had caught up with the United States, and in some areas of land-based missiles was even ahead of the United States. And the Soviet Union still felt, the people of the world certainly seemed to feel, or most observers, I should say, seemed to feel that the Soviet Union, while its economy was not competitive with the United States, was not hopelessly out of whack. By the time President Reagan came into office, the Soviet Union was a basket case. You can argue as to why the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, for example, took the line that he did with regard to reform at home and retrenchment abroad. I think that the major reason for that is not what he feared as far as the United States was concerned. That was a factor. But the major reason for that was the internal situation within the Soviet Union.
But don't forget, you yourself wrote in 1980 that the Soviets were winning the Cold War. Reagan became president in the 1980 election, so they would seem to have been at their high point then. So why doesn't it follow that if anybody was going to make an accommodation to them, Reagan should have, because they were strong? No, but it wasn't widely understood that they were a basket case at that point, was it?
That came during 1982, 83, 84. By the time that Gorbachev came into power, there was no question about it. And many more astute observers felt that they were a basket case, even in 1980. It just didn't suddenly happen. It just didn't work, that was it. But and also the fact that they were a basket case was highlighted by the fact that the West, after going through the malaise of the late 70s and after going through the recession of the early 80s, the West, and particularly the United States, had recovered. We had a booming, strong economy. And the contrast between the successful economy of the West, particularly the United States, and the basket case economy of the Soviet Union was what led Gorbachev to do what he did. Let's look at SDI for a moment. It's rather fashionable in the circles that you move in, that I move into, to say, well, that SDI didn't really amount to that much. SDI had an enormous effect on Gorbachev. I remember when I saw him in 1986, he said, look, we're a very strong people. We have a strong economy. I felt it was defensive, as a matter of fact. And we have our own SDI program, and we're doing things that you can't do. But he says, I object to SDI because it means that we're going to escalate an arms race. Deep down, what he was concerned about was not that militarily they couldn't do it, because they are very good in doing that sort of thing. But his concern was that he felt that it would bust the Soviet economy and that they couldn't afford it. So SDI played a role in his economic reforms.
Therefore, isn't the Reagan strategy better than the détente strategy that you pursued?
No, it's a question of time. The détente strategy, hard-headed détente, that I pursued worked. During the period I was president, there was no bit of territory was ever lost to the Soviet Union, any place in the world. And at that point, the Soviet Union, having closed the gap as far as military strength is concerned, now equal to the United States, that was the time to negotiate and to have stability. By the time that Reagan became president, the United States had gone through a period under Carter, the last years of Carter, in which the United States had fallen behind, particularly not so much militarily, but particularly in terms of its spirit. And so Reagan decided that this is a time for the United States to assert itself. If I had been president, elected president in 1980, I would have done, I think, exactly the same thing that Reagan did. It was the right time to take a strong stand against the Soviet Union because We had to rebuild our defenses. Let me put it this way. You can't have a détente strategy unless you are in a position of equality. Reagan felt in 1980 that the United States was not in a position to negotiate equally with the Soviet Union because we had to rebuild our defenses first. He was right, and that's why he was able to get his arms control and his other policies through.
I take it that you don't regard Reagan, though, as a strategist on a par with Gorbachev.
No, that is not Reagan's strength. Reagan's strength is something else, which Gorbachev perhaps does not have. Reagan's strength is that he was able to have vision about what he believed in. People, of course, knock Reagan as saying he wasn't hands on all the rest. He knew where he was going. And as a result of his 8 years, the American economy, which was in the doldrums, has come back so that America became strong economically, and the American military was strengthened. But more important, Reagan left something that can't be measured militarily or economically. The American spirit was better, and that was very, very important.
In 44 years as a public figure, you've met many, if not most, of the great figures of the 20th century. Do you put Gorbachev in this list now?
Oh, yes, there's no question that Gorbachev is in the top level of the leaders of the 20th century. Now, how he's going to survive historically remains to be seen. But at the present time, there's no question he is a world-class strategic thinker, a world-class political leader.
Do you think that Mikhail Gorbachev is going to make it?
I'm in the minority here. I think he will. I think he will make it not because he is a dedicated communist, and not because he is a very proud Russian nationalist, but because he is a very capable, shrewd politician. And his political instincts will make him land on his feet, even though the problems are infinitely great.
One gets the impression of these Soviet leaders like Brezhnev as stolid old men who had no personality or anything, yet you were probably the first president who really got to know him.
Yeah.
Brezhnev was not that way, I take it.
No, Brezhnev was very
character.
He was very earthy, and he liked the girls. Yeah, that was.
How could you tell?
Well, just the way he talked. I mean, he liked to tell jokes, maybe a little bit earthy. In fact, one of my favorite stories about him involved a time when I asked him, as I had asked Churchill, whether or not he ever used a dictaphone, and Churchill had said, "No, I don't." One of my friends gave me one of those machines, and he said, "I put it aside because I'd much rather dictate to a pretty secretary." And incidentally, Churchill with the league said, "And I have two very good-looking secretaries." I asked Brezhnev, without ever telling him about Churchill, the same thing when I first saw Brezhnev, in the same office, as a matter of fact, where I'd seen Khrushchev back in 1959. And Brezhnev said, "No." He says, "I don't use one of those machines." He said, "You know, I always prefer to dictate to a pretty secretary. And you know, when you wake up in the middle of the night and want to make a note, it's very convenient to have somebody in the room there with you to take it down." Brezhnev was another. What's that?
Was he kidding?
Oh no, oh no, no. Brezhnev, he was had that reputation, and as a matter of fact, most of the Russians that I have met prided themselves on being macho characters. I haven't heard that about Gorbachev. Gorbachev gets the impression of being a sort of, a touchy-feely kind of a politician. He plunges into crowds. But when I met him, and I had about an hour and a half, a little over, with him, I could sense that there was always something in reserve, more like the de Gaulles, the Churchills, and so forth.
Even though he has this reputation of being a politician.
Yeah,
a better politician.
he's a politician in the sense that he contacts people and all that sort of thing, but he is not one that gets too close to people or allows people to get too close to him.
Whereas the cat Bible totally cut, Disney brought it out to us. I've had party with life, companies, casting, harping, and airbearers. Yeah.
You describe your meeting with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong as the peak experience, perhaps, of your entire career. But couldn't it be said that you, prior to that, prevented any other president from having a rapprochement with China?
My position with regard to China prior to the time that I wrote the article for Foreign Affairs, a seminal article in 1967, in which I advocated a new approach to China,
my position was that as long as China was outside of the family of nations, as long as it was an aggressive power, the United States should not recognize it, and we should continue a policy of sanctions, which we did, and a policy of isolating it. I think that policy was correct at the time. However, I reached the conclusion in the late 60s, as I traveled around the world, that the time had come to make a move toward China, because I felt not that China, for example, was going to become a democratic country as a result of our initiatives, and not simply because China would be a counterweight to the Soviet Union, which was one of the reasons why, but because as I looked to the future, saw 1 billion people with enormous resources, a nuclear superpower, potentially, that it just didn't make sense for the United States not to have a
But, sir, there were loads of people, Democrats mainly, who said sometime after 1949, when the communists took over, there are 1 billion people in China, they're going to be a nuclear power, we've got to have relations with them, and yet you and other Republicans made it seem almost disloyal to the country to even think such things.
But when those people were saying that was at a time when the Chinese were responsible, along with the North Koreans, for killing 50,000 Americans in the Korean War. They were saying that at the time that the Chinese was still in an aggressive phase, when they were exporting their communist ideas, hardline communist ideas, all over Asia, into Indonesia, into the Philippines, etc. And that situation changed. In the late 60s, China began to turn inward. We got to remember this, coming back to 1947, 48. At that time, China was totally under the control of the Soviet Union. In 1959, China began to split from the Soviet Union. So by the time I addressed the problem, you had China and the Soviet Union no longer allies, in fact, potential adversaries, and China no longer an aggressive power. Well, they engaged in some activities, but not nearly as much as the Soviet Union.
Looking ahead at China, why is it necessary, given the forces as they are arrayed in the world right now, for the Bush administration to insist that we have to have good relations with China, regardless of what they do to their own people?
I don't believe that the Bush administration says exactly that. The Bush administration is concerned about what they do to their own people. It's concerned strategically as well. I would put it this way. In 1972, and this relates to your own earlier questions, we adjusted in which the United States isolated China, in which we had sanctions against China, and China at that time was even more repressive than the Soviet Union. They just killed millions in the Cultural Revolution, and yet we went. Had we not gone in 1972, had we not opened up China to the outside world, what happened in Tiananmen Square? There wouldn't have been any demonstrators there. There wouldn't have been any students, 100,000 that studied in the United States by the time of Tiananmen Square. So the American influence, the American relationship with China has been essential to the development of human rights in China. And now today, it is still essential. The United States, as demonstrated since 1972, will always use its influence for moderation.
Suppose we shunned them because of what happened in Tiananmen Square. They wouldn't go back to the Soviet Union, would they? What's the worst thing that could happen if we did it?
There are 4 potential players in Asia today, and among the major nations: China, the Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States. If the United States withdraws from the game, i.e. withdraws from a close association with China, it leaves the field to the Soviet Union and Japan. And neither the Soviet Union and Japan are going to use their influence for the cause of human rights.
You know, there's the same kind of argument is made about Vietnam, that we could have made friends with Ho Chi Minh, that John Foster Dulles declined to shake his hand, and if we had recognized Ho Chi Minh, could we have avoided the Vietnam War? By the same logic that we should maintain a good relationship with China.
If there was any doubt about the rightness of what we did in Vietnam, the rightness of President Reagan saying in 1980, and he was damned by it in the media for saying that it was a noble cause, there are between 1 and 2 million Cambodians that were slaughtered or starved to death. There are 600,000 Vietnamese who drowned in the South China Seas trying to get away from what Ho Chi Minh would have done to the balance of the country. Now, the United States was on the right side in Vietnam. Unfortunately, the Congress cut off the aid that was needed for the government of South Vietnam, or it would have survived. It did survive for 2 years, as you know, after the Paris Peace Agreement.
You would have sent troops into Vietnam, would you not, had you been elected in 1960?
Yeah. I would certainly have sent troops into Vietnam had I been elected, but I wouldn't have had to do it because I would never have joined in the conspiracy which resulted in the assassination of Diem. If Diem had not been assassinated, I do not believe it would have been necessary for troops to go to Vietnam. I think that he would have been able to have developed the defense forces with our assistance. I believe, in other words, that American foreign policy should be to help others fight their enemies, whoever they may be, but not to do the fighting for them. We should help with arms, we should help with advice, we should help with aid, but sending troops in is something we should not do if we can get others to do it for us. That's the so-called Nixon doctrine. The second point is that had I survived, had Watergate not occurred, I believe that it would have been possible to get the Congress to provide the funds that were necessary to see that the South Vietnamese received as much aid as the Russians were giving the North Vietnamese. Now, that is a closer question, because assuming that Watergate had occurred, I would have been damaged and my influence for the Congress was less. But I would have certainly fought for it right down the line. Had there been no Watergate, there's no question that South Vietnam would be a free, independent country today and a very prosperous one, rather than one of the poorest countries in the world under the communist rulers.
Did you ever contemplate the possibility of doing what Eisenhower did in Korea, that is, hinting that we might use nuclear weapons in the worst case?
That was suggested to me, but I never seriously considered it. I always felt that if you let the nuclear genie out of the bottle, no one could tell what would happen.
Not to
For
use
example,
them, but to threaten them.
Even to threaten them, because you couldn't really threaten them unless there was a possibility you could use them. It wasn't really. I think in the case of Eisenhower, at that point, it was a credible threat, due to the fact that the United States at the time of Korea had unquestioned superiority, absolute superiority. To threaten their use at a time that the Soviet Union was equal and in some areas superior to the United States, and when China also had them and they were unpredictable, I think would not have been credible.
You say in your book that somebody told you that Zhou Enlai actually once strangled somebody with his own hands.
Yes.
Do you believe that?
Oh, I think it's possible, yes. Zhou Enlai, of course, was the most civilized leader that I have met. I don't mean that the others were uncivilized, but he just gave the impression of a totally civilized kind of a person. And yet I know that on the way up, in the Long March and the rest, he had to be very ruthless. And I had this report, was frankly by an American Assistant Secretary of State, Willis Robertson. And I think it's possible. I'm not sure that it happened, but I think it's possible.
Now, Deng is somebody who's obviously killed a lot of people in Tiananmen Square. Is he a ruthless guy?
This Deng Xiaoping, who's now a pariah, he's the man that's the villain in all the media in the United States today. Was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1978 and again in 1985. You've got to remember that under his leadership, for 10 years, between 79 and 89, the per capita income of the Chinese people doubled. Under Gorbachev's leadership, it's gone down, the Russian people, so per capita income. So this man, I think, is proud of what he has accomplished. He regrets that the reforms have been set back. But to the extent that he can, at his advanced age, play a role, he's going to come down on the side, as the United States will, of the moderates in the power struggle that is already beginning in China as to who follows.
You never concede anything.
The only people Richard Nixon enjoyed jousting with as much as communists were Democrats, especially liberal Democrats. In successful bids for a House seat in 1946 and for the Senate in 1950, Nixon piled up points campaigning against communism and what he called the socialist economic policies of the Democrats. Dwight Eisenhower admired the political skills of the young senator from California and after some hesitation chose Nixon as his running mate in 1952. But Nixon's vice presidential candidacy was jeopardized by the first scandal of his young political career. Allegations of a shady expense fund set up for Nixon by wealthy benefactors prompted many Eisenhower aides to urge that Nixon be removed from the ticket. On September 23rd, at the El Capitan Studios in Los Angeles, Richard Nixon defended himself in a nationally televised speech.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. I would do nothing that would harm the possibilities of Dwight Eisenhower to become president of the United States. And for that reason, I am submitting to the Republican National Committee tonight through this television broadcast the decision which it is theirs to make. Let them decide whether my position on the ticket will help or hurt. And I'm going to ask you to help them decide. Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off. And whatever their decision is, I will abide by it.
It was to be one of the most important speeches of his political career. Telegrams expressing support for Nixon poured into Republican Party headquarters. A day later, Eisenhower met Nixon in Wheeling, West Virginia to confirm Nixon's spot on the ticket. Dick Nixon was once again Ike's boy. Eisenhower himself disdained politics, so it was Nixon who was sent out to do most of the stumping for Republican candidates across the country. Between 1952 and 1958, Nixon logged hundreds of thousands of campaign miles bashing Democratic candidates and raising money for Republicans. Nixon's efforts to build a Republican majority in America were sidetracked in 1960 when he lost to John Kennedy in a close election that featured the first ever televised presidential debates.
Secondly, I think the question is, what are the programs that we advocate?
Unlike the 1952 Checkers speech, Nixon's TV performance hurt his candidacy. Kennedy outshone Nixon in the debates and went on to win the White House. Nixon's victory would finally come in 1968 when he defeated Vice President Hubert Humphrey. But America had undergone dramatic changes in those 8 years. The assassinations of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., the stalemate in Vietnam, and swiftly changing social mores awakened a counterculture that challenged America's political and social institutions. By 1969, large anti-war demonstrations were a fixture on Pennsylvania Avenue and on college campuses throughout the country. On November 3rd of that year, President Nixon spoke from the Oval Office to justify his Vietnam policies in a direct appeal to the nation.
So tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
His landslide re-election in 1972 over Senator George McGovern convinced Nixon that the silent majority had spoken, even though the voters elected a Congress which was controlled by Democratic doves. But his forced resignation in 1974 again derailed Nixon's ambition of transforming the silent majority into a Republican political base. Even after the heady Reagan years and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, George Bush still faces Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress.
George Bush is highly popular. The Democrats don't seem to be able to get any handle on him. Is it because he's such a master of politics, or is there something wrong with the Democrats?
I think it's both. George Bush is a very skillful politician. And incidentally, I'm an expert on the press. I think he handles the press very well. So I have to have great respect for him for that. Beyond that, he has had a period, I would say this, where he may have had a couple of fumbles in his first year, but he's had no intercepted passes, and he's had no turnovers. In other words, it's a mistake-free administration, and therefore he hasn't given any particular targets for the opposition to shoot at. I think in appraising the Bush popularity, we have to recognize that, like Eisenhower in '56, when he was also enormously popular when he ran for the second term, he has peace, he has prosperity. Hard to run against either of those, but a very weak Democratic opposition. I think the weakest in 50 years. In 1956, Eisenhower was confronted with Speaker Sam Rayburn and with Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, and they were formidable political players. Oh, they talked about bipartisanship, but they knew that bipartisanship to them should only be engaged in when it serves a partisan interest.
But Bush is playing bipartisanship too, or at least he's talking bipartisanship, and many hardline conservatives think that he ought to find cutting-edge issues to slash away at the Democrats.
Bush has a political problem. Some people say, why hasn't he done what Johnson did when Johnson first came in and he had all of his great initiatives and so forth, some bad, some good. The point is, Johnson had overwhelming majorities in the House and Senate. Bush does not. There are still Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. He's got to be bipartisan to be effective. I would say that Bush, on the other hand, has benefited from the fact that the Democrats simply are not able to seize upon any issue that grabs them. You're not going to get the whole country excited about global warming. You're not going to get the whole country excited about some of these other domestic issues.
Is there anything lying around there that they will get excited about?
The thing that will be lying around will be if economic downturn, even slowdown occurs, and if as a result of that, a great number of Americans will believe that they're not getting their fair share. The Democrats are best when they are for the underdog. Franklin D. Roosevelt preached that. Harry Truman did. John F. Kennedy, to an extent, not quite as much. Lyndon Johnson, all out. And when that time occurs, if it does, I hope it doesn't, but when that time occurs, when as a result of an economic slowdown, a lot of people feel that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, the Democrats will be able to do something. But there's only one on the scene that I think that could do that, and that's Cuomo. We talk about the Democratic candidates, and they just haven't got any horses at the present time. You say Cuomo after what happened the last time they nominated a governor? Well, you want to remember, Franklin D. Roosevelt was the governor.
And what does Mario Cuomo have to offer that makes him, I gather, your most formidable candidate for '92?
Cuomo has high intelligence. He has heart. At least he appears to have, and that's what matters. His weakness is his demagoguery on foreign policy. He's got to get more responsible in foreign policy than his speech, otherwise a brilliant speech at San Francisco in 1984 indicated. But Cuomo would be able to seize upon this the haves versus the have-not issue more effectively than any of the other Democrats because of his appeal. Another thing at Cuomo, he is very good insofar as Q&A and speaking is concerned. Debates between him and George Bush, they would be very interesting to watch. I think they'd be very good.
Would Cuomo have a chance at winning? And what would he have to do to have a chance to win?
I think George Bush will be reelected in 1992, but Cuomo would have a chance only if there is some economic slowdown between now and 1992. Given the present situation of peace and prosperity, with world affairs going as they are, Bush will win in 1992, although it will be closer than 1988. Cuomo is the only one that could make it a close race.
Who else do you think will run for the Democratic nomination?
Well, there's always plenty of people that are ready to line up to run, but I don't see anything. I think Gebhardt, I'm rather puzzled by him because you see him on television, he's a very good-looking man. His wife is really extremely attractive. But I think he's hurt himself by demagoguing the Japanese issue. It doesn't sound as if he really means it because he goes so far in doing so. And I think that he is losing some of his basically Democratic constituency as a result.
Isn't it possible that Gebhardt is trying to do with the Japanese what Richard Nixon did with the Russians back in the 50s? That is, to make a reputation by picking out what he believes to be a clear and present enemy and firing at him.
Franklin D. Roosevelt once told John Connally, you must always have an enemy, John, rather than this idea of consensus and so forth and so on. And this, of course, relates to that point. I think that's a non-starter. First, I think it's wrong. Strategically, it's not in the interest of the United States, but it's a non-starter for another reason. Let's look at Japan for just a moment. It's going to be a major competitor of ours for the balance of this century and into the next century. But as far as Japan is concerned, we have to realize that if all of the issues we have with Japan, insofar as unfair trade was concerned, were resolved, it would affect only 10% of the trade we have in the world at the present time. The problem is not that these trade restrictions that the Japanese put up, some of them non-tariff barriers, and that should be removed. The problem is that we're making the Japanese a scapegoat for some of our own problems. And looking at Japan, I know you can raise questions, but the Japanese own this bank and they own this movie studio. Would it surprise our listeners to know and our viewers to know that the Dutch own more of the United States than the Japanese? The problem is for the United States to recognize that Japan, as a result, in part, that we help them as our previous enemies recover from World War II, as a result from also their own hard work, etc. The Japanese are going to be competitors. But what we have to do is to compete, but look to ourselves for the problem rather than making a scapegoat of the Japanese.
Are you afraid that an adversarial relationship might develop between the United States and Japan?
Yes. At the present time, I'm concerned about American bashing of Japan, and I'm concerned also about Japanese bashing of the United States, which is increasing day by day. It is vitally important that the two economic superpowers in the free world compete with each other, but that we also not have an adversarial, basically a Cold War attitude. We should bear in mind that the playing field must be level. Now, one advantage that Japanese companies have that American companies don't have is that the Japanese government always cooperates with the Japanese companies. In the United States, we often find the United States government in an adversarial position with American companies. American companies, in order to compete successfully with the Japanese, have to have that advantage removed.
You started your political career in the pre-TV era, or as TV was just coming in to dominate American politics, and obviously your experience is with the TV era. What's the difference? How has television changed American politics?
Trivialized it. Television is an entertainment medium, as you know. I mean, we think, for example, we're educating people with this interview. We're not educating people. They're looking at us. They want to see a little fight. They want to see a little conflict and so forth. And when we get through, they wouldn't be able to tell you what we talked about. But that's television. And so in the time before television, when I campaigned in 46, when I campaigned in 48 for the national ticket for Dewey, and then in 1950 as well, television just didn't play a role at all. But that meant that the print press played a much bigger role. It also meant that politics was much more serious. I mean, there was really serious discussion of issues. With television, too much emphasis is on quips, on what'll fit in the 10 seconds in the evening news and the rest, rather than on serious discussion. Now, image is very important. Image is, I think, all important in television. And that's why, frankly, you should be more concerned about your makeup artist than your researcher. The one that blows your hair dry rather than what's between your ears. That's television. Yeah.
I was planning to like somebody was talking out the interviews. That's
Are you at all troubled by the fact that we only get 50% of the registered vote out, or less than 50% for a presidential election? Does it have anything to do with negative campaigning?
The highest vote percentage, I was looking at some figures just the other day, in recent years was in 1960. And part of the reason, I think, was that both candidates, everybody, my Democratic friends would say certainly Kennedy, my Republican friends would say Kennedy. It was close. People come out when it's close. And the candidates were young, and people will come out for a good fight. I think if you get top flight candidates, if it's highly competitive, that we can get the percentage of vote up. But I must say it hasn't been hopeful in recent years.
Does negative campaigning have anything to do with it? Or do you think that negative campaigning is a bad thing?
I was trying to avoid answering that question, but I would say that as far as the negative campaigning is concerned, I do think it turns off a lot of people. Now, by negative campaigning, I'm not referring to campaigning hard on the issues. Harry Truman, he gave the Republican 80th Congress hell, in addition to giving a music critic hell who criticized his daughter singing. But he won giving him hell. But he was talking about issues, not personalities.
Speaking of hardball politics, let me ask you about 1960. You had been a senator and a congressman along with John Kennedy, and he had the reputation up until the 1960 race of being something of a playboy and not a terribly serious senator. Did you ever underestimate him?
I didn't underestimate him because I served with him. We came to the Congress together. We agreed on foreign policy throughout our careers in the Congress after I became vice president. We disagreed on some domestic policies due to the fact that he came from a liberal Democratic district, I came from a conservative Republican district. But I always felt that Kennedy was their strongest candidate. And when people said, well, he can't win because he's a Catholic, I said, forget it. That'll help him. And it did. Because, interestingly enough, when I ran against Helen Gahagan in 1950, I got about 45% of the Catholic vote, in part because they were more supportive of me on the Greek-Turkish aid and these other programs that I've spoken about. They were strongly anti-communist. Against John F. Kennedy, I received the lowest percentage of the Catholic vote of any candidate in history, Democrat or Republican. Now, I understand that. If I had been a Catholic, first chance for a Catholic really to win, Al Smith had no chance, I probably voted that way too.
In 1960, you must have been in possession of material about Kennedy's character and so on, yet it never came out. In view of the closeness of the election, why not?
I think that we probably felt it would be counterproductive. I don't want to indicate to you that we didn't bring things out because we wanted to be so much above the battle and campaign only on the issues. I'm sure that he and we would have done virtually anything, which might be legal, in order to win, knowing it was going to be a very close election. But under the circumstances, I thought it was my view then, and it's been my view since, that engaging in criticism of a candidate's personal activities is counterproductive. I don't like to do it. I also think it hurts. And I think in this case, that was probably what prevailed when I met with my advisors. It was the idea was raised, of course, because it was no secret.
But in view of what happened to Gary Hart, it certainly would have handed you the election, wouldn't it?
Different situation. In 1960, it is unlikely that the media would have played the role that they did in the Gary Hart case. The media, even though Gary Hart was closer to them with their liberal views than certainly others were, the media, on the other hand, couldn't resist that kind of a story, and they blew it up. In 1960, I'm inclined to think that the media would have discarded it. The media would not have played an aggressive role in going after Kennedy that they did after Hart.
Why?
First, I think because they felt closer to Kennedy in some ways. I mean, he was very effective with the media. They liked him. Second, he was more liberal than I was. Not as liberal as some, and not as liberal as Stevenson, but more liberal than I was, and they liked that. But I think, too, it's just a change in the whole attitude of the press. Today, the press, particularly because of television, not so much the print press, the press is almost exclusively interested in scandal. You can have a big piece on the homeless, and it won't even make the evening news if you've got something about somebody sleeping with somebody else's wife.
Let me ask you a speculative question about John Kennedy. If he had lived, do you suppose that we would have had the turmoil that we had in the 1960s? Would he have persisted in the Vietnam War and so on?
I know there's been a lot of speculation that he might have discontinued his support of the South Vietnamese and would have wound up the war. I don't agree. John Kennedy was a very strong person and a very decisive person, except for what I consider to be his mistake in knocking off the second airstrike at the Bay of Pigs. He took strong action, for example, on the Cuban confrontation. I think John Kennedy, as distinguished from Johnson, would not have gone forward with a policy of gradualism. I think he would have taken strong action to bring the war to an end at an earlier date, and he would not have escalated as Johnson did. At least that's my judgment, knowing the man as I did.
So you think the turmoil that followed would not have taken place, that the cultural revolution of the United States during the 60s might have been avoided?
Well, that's another subject. I think the cultural revolution had a life of its own. I think it was very unfortunate, and because I don't happen to be a man of the 60s in that respect. To give John F. Kennedy his due and Johnson his due, I think Kennedy would have taken a stronger position on Vietnam than Johnson did. I do not think he would have let it drag on, because he was a decisive kind of a person, and also he thought he had enough public support. I think that Kennedy, on the other hand, would not have bitten the bullet on civil rights, which Johnson did. Just as I was the only one who could have gone to China in 1972, Johnson was the only one who could have brought about the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we give both men credit where it's due.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone?
You know, when I was on French television back in 1978, and that was the major subject of interest, I was on for 3 hours, and over and over, they think there's a conspiracy. I don't know. And I refuse to read the new books and see the new docudramas and so forth. I don't think docudramas are any good anyway, but that's another matter. I don't think much of TV.
But you never saw any information while you were president to suggest that his attempts to kill Castro inspired Castro to kill him, or any such thing?
No. I have never seen any information of that type. All that I know is what I read in books and the newspapers and what I have seen, modest amount on TV.
Is there somebody in your time that you thought ought to have been president and never made it?
I would rate Tom Dewey in that category. I campaigned for him in 1948 when I was a congressman. I got to know him very well later, throughout my period as vice president and the years out of office, and also until he died while I was president. He had some extraordinarily good qualities. Above everything else, in addition to his own high intelligence, he picked very good. His staff were outstanding. He was confident enough of his own abilities that he wasn't afraid to pick people that were as smart as he was, and that's a mark of an executive. Dewey was a first-class geopolitical thinker. He understood foreign policy, and his judgment was excellent. And finally, I like Dewey because he was about in the same mainstream of politics that I was. I mean, I wasn't against Taft, but Dewey had took the same views, for example, on civil rights that I did, a more, shall we say, progressive view than some of the Republicans. But Dewey would have made a great president without question.
If he'd beaten Truman, we would have had the same foreign policy that Truman had, and also the same domestic policy. How would they have... A big thing.
Richard Nixon's political successes far outstripped Thomas Dewey's. And in reaching the heights he did, in the way he did, Nixon made many enemies. As an unabashedly partisan politician, Nixon rankled the likes of Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, Adlai Stevenson, and many others. When Nixon arrived at the White House in 1969, he geared up for battle with new enemies. A Democratic Congress bent on frustrating his policy initiatives at home and in Vietnam. The Neuberger Supreme Court, which refused to overturn the Miranda decision or ban busing. Even in his own federal bureaucracy, President Nixon saw a nest of opponents.
Scores of the country's top newsmen keep close tabs on the proceedings.
But highest on the Nixon enemies list were the media. Going back to the Hiss case in 1948, Nixon felt that the media were both tremendously powerful in shaping opinions and afflicted with a liberal bias in their reporting of news. The 1950s provided a truce of sorts in the battle between Nixon and the media, mainly because of generous coverage of his trips abroad as vice president. But after 1968, the antagonism resumed, and the battleground was Vietnam. Between Nixon's election in November and his inauguration in January, nearly 3,000 American soldiers were killed in Vietnam. The drumbeat of negative press coverage reached a crescendo. Each day, Nixon would devour 50 or so pages of news summaries prepared by Patrick Buchanan and other aides. In the margins, Nixon would pen directives to get this or that reporter for unfavorable comments about his Vietnam policies. In his memoirs, Nixon writes, "The media are far more powerful than the president in creating public awareness and public opinion." By the beginning of Nixon's second term in 1973, his administration was engulfed in the scandal that would bring down his presidency. In an effort to strike back at his enemies, Nixon used the Justice Department and secret teams of White House operatives to wiretap political enemies and radical groups. What began as a third-rate burglary attempt at the offices of Democratic National Committee Chairman Lawrence O'Brien at the Watergate complex mushroomed into a cover-up that sent top Nixon aides to prison for perjury and obstruction of justice. On August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency of the United States.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
His enemies had triumphed. Richard Nixon had helped the system bring him down.
President Eisenhower at one point said that the press could never hurt you. Yet it did seem to hurt you, or it got under your skin. Why is that?
I would say that as far as the press is concerned, my relations were sort of mixed. When I was abroad, whenever I went abroad, including incidentally my trips to China and to Russia as president and other trips abroad, I got a universally fair press and a good press. Politics stopped at the water's edge, which does not happen, incidentally, with politicians too much. The press deserves great credit for that, and I appreciated it. On the other hand, we have to recognize that I'm a conservative. I was involved, too, with two seminal issues. The Hiss case, where the press, many of them, felt that it was simply McCarthyism, and then it discouraged them even more when Eisenhower and others gave me credit for handling the matter fairly, and the other was the Vietnam War.
But do you think the press was fundamentally led by its ideology, that's its strongest motivation is not to tell the truth, but to tilt things in the left-wing direction?
No question in my mind. What I'm suggesting here is this with regard to the press. This one won't surprise you, but it will surprise some of our viewers. I treasure my good relations with many members of the press over the years. They are not slobs, as some people think. They are not inaccurate, as many people think. Generally, I have been really surprised at how accurately they report if you give them an interview. And I would say, too, however, that the press generally is biased. Most of them try very hard, many of them try very hard to keep the bias out of the reporting. But where it's a liberal bias, it's extremely difficult for them to do so. And I would say that as far as the press is concerned, I am a conservative, and I was probably one of their favorite pinup boys. They had my photograph of me over the press club bar, and they throw darts into it.
But you were a sort of centrist conservative, and Ronald Reagan, for example, is far more right-wing than you were, and the press got along with him.
I think that may be due to the fact that he was never involved, however, in one of these what I call seminal issues. Sure, the Panama Canal, that didn't make anybody lose any sleep over. The fact that he took a position on that was different from, or shall we say, the conventional wisdom in the Beltway and so forth. In my case, looking at the period of the Vietnam War, which really ran from about, for me, from about 1962 or 3, up until the time I left the presidency, the country was divided, the press was divided, and I would say 85 to 90% of the press was against me in the war. About 60% of the country was for me
You said
at certain times.
You said something about handling the press, that George Bush handles the press well, and Ronald Reagan perhaps handled the press well. Why did you not handle the press well?
It was extremely difficult for me in that period. I'm speaking now of my period as presidency, because in the period of the Vietnam War, my press conferences were really shootouts. And also there were many occasions when I was engaged in secret diplomacy with the Chinese, secret diplomacy with the Russians, secret diplomacy to bring the war in Vietnam to an end. During that period, there were just times that I couldn't go before the press and be forthright, which is what I preferred to do if I possibly could. I should have had more press conferences than I did, but under the circumstances, I'm not sure they would have done that much good in view of the fact that the press really had already made up its mind as far as the issues I was going to discuss. There was no way that I could get a fair hearing on the Vietnam War position because they disagreed with it. I'm not suggesting that they're totally wrong, I was totally right. I'm simply saying that explains it in my view.
Was the press your foremost enemy?
I have, as far as enemies are concerned, I don't want to leave the impression that enemies should be viewed in terms of just total all-out war. By enemies, they're opponents. They're opponents. They didn't agree with me. I didn't agree with them. And so we fought it out.
But the liberals really went after you. The liberals and the press.
Oh,
and
yes.
they used Watergate as a club.
Well, in fairness to them, I gave them the club. And they can't be blamed for that. But I think they welcomed getting it, and they did it with relish, because I'd also had the misfortune of proving them wrong on the occasion. I remember so well that after I had the famous fun broadcast, you remember when I was vice president?
Checker's speech.
That's right. And my press secretary said that all the members of the press corps from the Eisenhower plane were out there for the hanging. And then when I had the speech and it totally turned around public opinion, there's nothing, according to Bert Andrews of the New York Herald Tribune, he says there's nothing that turns off an intellectual more than to prove wrong. The same is true with regard to Vietnam. When I made my silent majority speech in 1969, when everybody was saying, because of the demonstrations, hundreds of thousands, and a lot of it was pretty rough, demonstrating around the White House, etc., I made a speech on television that turned around public opinion. And that is something that didn't help me with the press.
Did you set out to get your enemies while you were president? Larry O'Brien's name comes to mind, who was investigated by the IRS and who may have been the target of the Watergate break-in. I know you didn't order it, you've said many times, but nonetheless, he seems to be somewhere near the top, and I don't understand why.
No, if I were out to get them, I would have done a much more effective job. As far as Larry O'Brien is concerned, what was involved there very simply was that the IRS was conducting field audits of many of my major supporters and friends, and I felt they should also conduct field audits of top Democrats who were doing exactly the same thing. In other words, everybody should pay his taxes.
But didn't you use the IRS to punish enemies?
Not at all. I used the IRS for the purpose of leveling the playing field. The IRS at that time was conducting field audits primarily of people who were my supporters.
Why would they do that?
Because it had that kind of a bias, and it still does. Look at the way they're going after poor Mrs. Reagan on her dresses and so forth. They wanted to pay taxes on dresses of her own to her. That's, I think, a little bit beyond the pale. It's political. The IRS is not a non-political group.
Why? What makes them political? I wasn't aware that Internal Revenue Service agents had one particular persuasion or another.
Generally speaking, the IRS, like all the government bureaucracy, tilts to the left. All of your polls will show that. And as far as the IRS is concerned, it is no exception. I'm not suggesting by that there aren't a great number of very dedicated, very honest IRS officials, and that the people at the top are engaged in that activity. But generally speaking, in all government bureaucracy, you find very few that tilt to the right. They tilt to the left, because take your smart kids that go to college, young people. The ones that have the top grades who are conservative go into business. The one who have the top grades who are liberal, they go into the media or they go into government.
Mm-hmm. And therefore they're liberal, and therefore
be liberal.
They were likely to be Nixon enemies, or operate to be thwart the Nixon administration.
Yeah, they're likely to be, yes. Nobody has suggested that the bureaucracy during the time I was president was pro-Nixon. All the polls indicated it was substantially against.
Of all the enemies that you've accumulated all over these many years, are there one or two that you really cannot forgive for whatever they did to you?
No, I have no feelings about that. Particularly political enemies. I understand that. I mean, politics, that's the way the game is played. And I think in most cases the political enemies were not personal, but it had to do with policy. I understand policy differences.
Did you come to like any of them? I mean, are there any of them that you actually came around to appreciating as human beings?
Well, one in particular, now that we're at this house, I did learn to know and to like him very much, was Ed Muskie. Muskie, as you know, was a potential candidate back in 1972 and then came a cropper. We were working on arms control, and it was interesting to work with Muskie on arms control. We happened to see things pretty much alike then, but it was also interesting to know him as a man. He has a marvelous sense of humor. He's a Coolidge buff, used to tell all kinds of stories about Coolidge. But we became very good personal friends, although we were political adversaries.
But he was never one of the Nixon haters, was he?
I would put it this way. When he was campaigning for getting the Democratic nomination, he wouldn't have a prayer unless he had been a Nixon hater.
Mm-hmm. Who were the primary people in the Congress who were vexing you especially? It seemed it was most of the people on the Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, who denied you 2 Supreme Court justices in a row. That was Teddy Kennedy.
Yes. The Supreme Court fights, I understood, however, that really had nothing to do with the qualifications of the people. One of the great losses for the country was the failure to confirm Hainsworth. Hainsworth would have been a great justice. And they brought up some phony issue about ethics, which turned out to be absolutely nothing. And Strom Thurmond, incidentally, thinks that it was a great miscarriage of justice. He was on the Judiciary Committee on the Republican side.
They kept after you. I remember the ITT scandal that had, there was sort of one thing after another. It seemed to be mainly Judiciary Committee Democrats who were harrying you more or less the whole time.
It could have been Democrats, but also it could be staffers. You would generally find that the most hard-nosed types of political people are on the staffs rather than at the top level. And the staff people have got to make names for themselves, and they got to prove that they're smart and tough and the rest. And you'll find that they can poison the water pretty good. Was not a conservative in his domestic policy. Truman had his quote.
It's been fairly clearly established that anything that your administration did during Watergate had been done by the Johnson administration and by the Kennedy administration. Why do you think the system conspired to get you?
I would say that the system, if it did conspire against to get me, did so because my views were totally contrary to theirs. Basically, it was, generally speaking, not the conservative Democrats or the conservatives in the media. It was generally the liberals.
And they had such power that they could bring down a president.
Well, only if the president was handled himself in a way that he gave them the means to do so, which I did in my failure to handle the Watergate thing as I should have.
The problem in Watergate, of course, was not the deed. That had happened before, too, wiretapping and all that sort of thing, and bugging. The problem was in not dealing with it forthrightly and directly and trying to cover it up for political purposes. My mistake in Watergate was, at that time, to put politics, what I consider to be a political necessity, above the statesmanship. The president's primary responsibility, among many others, his primary responsibility, it is to enforce the law of the land. And I did not effectively do that, and I had to pay the price for it.
Looking back on it, what would you have done? Who would you have fired?
I couldn't tell you that at this time because I just don't know even now what would have been the case. All that I do know is this, that everybody who was involved in Watergate, I'm referring to John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General, I'm referring to Bob Halton and the others, all of the people that were involved did not do it for selfish reasons. Watergate, contrary to the public perception, was not a scandal like the whiskey scandals involving money, like Teapot Dome, which involved money, like the Truman 5% scandals, which involved money. Nobody profited from Watergate at all. That was the tragedy of it. Everyone who did anything on the Watergate matter in the administration did so because they thought they were serving the interests of my reelection. It was a mistake, and as a matter of fact, it was politically stupid because there was no way George McGovern was going to win anyway. And that was my political mistake as well. I should have knocked it off right then and said, let's find out who did this and let him walk the plank. I didn't do that, though.
Who do you think did authorize the break-in?
I won't even speculate on that either, because that's something that historians are going to have to argue about for, as I'm sure they will, for many years.
You're a betting man. You made a lot of money in the Navy. What would you bet that it was your campaign manager, John Mitchell?
No, I wouldn't bet that. John Mitchell himself has indicated that he was there when the matter was discussed. We're talking about the break-in.
Correct.
And certainly he has assumed responsibility for that. But John Mitchell is a very shrewd political operator. He would never approve such a really a stupidly handled matter. I mean, 5 people going in to place a bug? They looked as if they were looking to be caught.
Do you have some thought that they were looking to be caught, that this was some kind of a setup?
I have read that, and I am really not able to comment upon it. In fact, let me just say about Watergate, and people want me to sometimes write articles on it or answer questions and so forth. But I covered it, as you know, at great length in my memoirs, 400 tightly reasoned pages, research by Diane Sawyer and Ken Kachigan and Frank Gannon. I covered it again at length in the Frost Broadcast. I covered it again in my latest book, in Arena. And now I think 18 years of Watergate is enough. I really haven't got anything to add to it.
Well, let me just push you a little further. Is it possible that there was a lack of trust in Richard Nixon in other people that got transmitted down the line to various people in the administration such that they thought that there were enemies all around?
It is possible. I know that has been written and suggested by some, that the administration had a bunker mentality, that we were paranoid about enemies, and that therefore those people who, one, engaged in the break-in, and 2, who tried to cover it up, felt that in effect they were doing what I wanted. And I can understand how that happened. I did not intend that, and certainly it wasn't justified.
I think during the Frost interview, you said that if a president does something, it's not illegal. You still believe that?
Oh, that's no question about that. But I'm not the source for that. In that broadcast with Frost, I was quoting Lincoln. Lincoln pointed out, when he was under criticism for denying habeas corpus and taking another very strong actions during the Civil War, he said, there are some actions which under normal circumstances would be illegal, become legal if the president orders them because of the security of the country. And for example, that would cover the wiretapping to stop the leaks, which we did engage in. Now, as a matter of fact, they were not illegal. They did not become illegal until about 1972 when the Supreme Court case came down. But
how about
that's the context in which I made the statement on fraud.
But how about
I'm not suggesting that anything a president does is legal. I am suggesting that that's in some areas, an action that otherwise would be illegal becomes legal in the event that a decision is made that it involves the national security.
You've said that you regard that conversation on that tape, which was often called the smoking gun, as not revealing anything illegal, right?
That's correct.
So then why, when that tape came out, did you begin the process of resigning? Why didn't you stay and fight it out?
Well, why I didn't stay and fight it out goes far beyond that tape. The forces for impeachment had grown so strong that there was no way that I could govern effectively. And under the circumstances, resignation was the only course that any responsible person, leader, could have taken.
But on the merits, you think you could have won?
On the merits? On the merits, I have always felt that I would have preferred to have fought it out, and gone through the impeachment process. But there's no way that could have possibly, a decision like that could be made without it being detrimental to the interest. You couldn't have the President of the United States in the dock for 6 months at a time that you have foreign policy problems all the way from Cyprus to Moscow.
Is this your last book? There's a tone about this book that seems to be making peace with your adversaries, explaining the whole thing. Do you think this is it?
Well, my last book would not be one where I would make peace with my adversaries. That'd be totally contrary to my whole career. I don't mean that I enjoy having adversaries. I do mean, however, that I don't go along with this idea that the best politics is consensus politics. In our system, if you're going to have an effective government action, it has to be adversarial. You have to have conflict. You don't have to be a Hegelian to recognize that the meshing together of two good ideas creates a better idea.
Well, which adversaries would you like to get yet?
Well, that list is too long for this program.
Mr. President, thanks very much for being with us. For American Interests, I'm Morton Kondracke.